Welcome, everybody, back to another special interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. We have an extremely special guest, and longtime listeners of the show will know my particular obsession with a company called Commodore. And today we have a veteran of that fine institution, Mr. Don Greenbaum. And did I say that right, or did I mess it up? I got it right. Okay. Don, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to chat with you, Carl, and go back in the time machine for my days as treasurer of Commodore.
Oh, yes. I am so looking forward to this one. I'm almost on pins and needles. So we start all these interviews off because we love our chronology here on the show. Take us back. Tell us a little bit about your educational background. You have an education in both business, but you also have a background in technology as a hobbyist. So give us a little bit of the background on that.
Okay, I graduated in 1973 from Rutgers. I got a master's from the Baruch College in the city of New York. I then taught finance at Pace for a while. I was a commercial banker. And I had a technology background because back at the age of 11, I was a ham radio operator, building my own radios. And in the 70s, actually, built one out of a Kim board, which was a major part of the rest of my life because of what we will get to shortly. But that's the education background. In the late 70s, I was a vice president at Manufacturers Hanover.
Okay. And so you were a vice president there, and how did you end up moving over to Commodore then?
So in the late 70s, I think it was 1978, among my portfolio of companies that Manufacturers Hanover was lending to was Pan Am, TWA, and a company that did containers, a company called Interpool. The chairman of Interpool was one Irving Gould. Irving invested in many companies. He had a company in New Jersey that packaged little Tide pellets for laundry machines that, back in the laundromats. He was chairman of Interpool, which was the first company that did intermodal containers. Our lending to them that I met Mr. Gould. And I remember having lunch with him based on Interpool, and he mentioned his other companies, and he mentioned Commodore. And I said, oh, I have one of your companies. And he practically fell off his chair because he had never met anyone who actually used that. And I told him about, I had it doing radio teletype for my ham radio hobby. He said, oh, you've got to meet this guy, Jack Tramiel. And the next time Jack was in New York, I, in fact, did meet Jack. So that's how I was introduced to Commodore. It wouldn't be for 4 or 5 years before I went to work.
Okay. Now, I have to ask this question. In your conversation with Irving Gould, and am I pronouncing the name right? Because I've never heard anybody. Gould. Okay. Did he seem to have a grasp of the technology? Because again, this is one of those things that is often levied against him, that he was just in it for the money and stuff. When you said, you had used the Kim board and what you used it for, did he seem to understand what that even meant?
Actually, he understood what I was using it for. Irving had an eye for things in the future. Remember, nobody was thinking of containerization back then, and he invested in this startup that did that, which, by the way, was sold in the late 70s to Thyssen-Bornemisza, and that name will come back later when Jack was okay. But Thyssen-Bornemisza bought Interpool, which gave Irving $30-odd million, which he then invested at Manufacturers Hanover in CD. He was an early investor with Jack in Commodore. He invested in specialty packaging. These are all things that in the 70s were on nobody's horizon. So when people say Irving didn't know anything about what he was investing in, I think you have to take that with it.
Gotcha. And that makes a lot more sense now you put it into that context. So, okay. So, you met Jack. What was your first meeting with Jack like?
So we had lunch. Jack was there. Irving was there. Lee Schreiber legal counsel who was also based in New York. We all had lunch. Jack was a wonderful man. Like my father, he escaped Europe during the war. We talked about that. We really, really had a great lunch, and we talked about how they were never a bankable commodity. Despite their success with calculators, despite their success in the PET and Kim boards, none of the majors would finance Commodore. And in fact, when I proposed it to officers higher up, the loan office at Manufacturers Hanover, they did their due diligence and found the Atlantic acceptance disaster with the debt. Jack had a reputation, if you will, of the number of bankruptcies. Irving Gould had some skeletons in his closet through some things that is, with his brother. You can look all that up in Canada. There were a lot of shady deals, a lot of defaulted debt. And the only way Commodore was a bankable commodity was if Irving Gould would guarantee the debt with his deposits on loan, or deposits that were placed.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that does make things a little bit more difficult.
Right. So I was the loan officer when Commodore announced that Manufacturers Hanover had lent it $3 million, which was its first debt that it took on after the Atlantic acceptance debacle.
Oh, wow. So this would have been, what, 1979?
Yeah, 79 and 8.
Oh, wow. That is a long time then, with no major debt.
But they were coming out with the VIC-20, and they needed...
Okay. And was the company was already public at that point, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it was over the counter.
Yeah.
Okay. Flight trading.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So the VIC-20 comes out, and obviously is a massive success, almost out of the gate.
Yep.
And what is your relationship with Commodore at that point? Still loan officer?
I am its lead banker at Manufacturers Hanover, and some other banks then got interested. Once the door opened, and the company was growing and beginning to make some money, not a massive amount of money. Jack was out corner the market. The price leader in cutting prices was Tramiel. He was out there to gain market share, not build a bottom line. He ran a tight company. He was doing it, the whole masses, not the classes thing. But he was successful, and the company was growing, and the appetite of the banks, having seen that growth. So for the next couple of years, we started putting together larger and larger loans. The personal guarantee of Irving Gould went away because the very first loan said the minute the capital of the company was negligible, got to be more than that $3 million, the loan would guarantee would go away. And in fact, it did. And I was having meetings with Irving and Jack at that point, quarterly, monthly. I had met most of the officers, many of the names that you've covered in the past.
Gotcha. Now, and just to paint a picture of the banking business at that time, how much of an insight or into the inner workings of the company did you have before that first loan went through? I mean, as far as manufacturing, operations, and all that, and the breakdown of the cost structure of what a VIC-20 was going to cost, for example.
The amount of information banks get is pretty in-depth. When you have a company that's, talking about tripling in size in the next year, you do your due diligence. We got all the cash flow forecasts. Dick Sanford and I and Greg Pratt, these are all names back in the early 80s, would meet, talk on the phone almost daily. And I had a pretty good understanding of how Hong Kong was manufacturing, how other vendors were, the corporate structure of everything passed through the Bahamas in terms of cost structure. We knew about a tax audit. Every year they were being audited because most of the profits stayed in the Bahamas or Basel, Switzerland. So there were not a lot of surprises to the banking group after we got into it.
Gotcha. And the VIC-20 was also famously first computer that sold at mass retail. Now, I believe that happens maybe in year 2 of the machine primarily, but where you could go into a mass retailer. Was that a major concern because there was no precedent for what if it would work or wouldn't work?
It was not a concern to the banks because it fueled the growth. It made it a household name. And most of the computer shops back then didn't have great credit. So the receivables on the books of Commodore always had a fair number of write-offs. And I remember when Jack decided to Kmart, Walmart, or what they were called back then, Sears, the big concern of the banks was these are receivables that you could borrow again. These are receivables of major corporations. No one had ever heard of ABC Computers on 43rd Street selling 10 VIC-20s a day. But now all of a sudden you had economies of scale for production, the same thing. And there was a big upheaval. Everybody said Jack screwed the little computer dealer that got him going, the old pet dealer network. But Commodore never would have been Commodore if the marketing people hadn't crashed the prices, and I mean significant. I remember the VIC-20 came down from like $500 to $300 with the big announcement at Sears. And that Christmas, they couldn't make them fast.
Yeah. So, okay, so the VIC-20 hits big. Cash is coming in. Irving is no longer personally guaranteeing everything. So when does your relationship change from the banker to the treasurer?
So in May of '83, we put together a $60 million multi-bank loan agreement. And that was the first major financing deal that Commodore had ever done. I mean, we're now going from $3 million personal loan to $60 million bank consortium. In June of that year, I got moved out of the office where Commodore was being banked, and I was promoted down to Wall Street, totally different. And the minute I left being Commodore's banker, Irving started literally saying, we need you here. Come work for us. And I resisted it until the amount of money being offered to leave Manufacturers Hanover on Wall Street to being a vice president at an international public company in the fall of '83. I resigned from the bank and went to work for Commodore. Initially, they put me in Rock Center with a man named Steven Greenberg, who was doing their Wall Street analysis and Wall Street interaction with the brokerage firm. And so I became vice president of investor relations, and I started meeting with the Solomon Brothers and the Merrill Lynch and all the people covering the stock. So that was my first role at Commodore. 6 months later, the treasurer left. Dick Sanford went off to, well, let me back up. Within 2 months of joining Commodore, Jack Tramiel left.
I was about to say, I mean, there's a big event there.
I joined it 2 months before the proverbial shit hit the fan, and I was no longer needed to handle investor relations as stock had crashed. I was more important to then dealing on the other side of the table with the banking group because they were nervous. The founder had left. What was going on? The company was going bonkers selling Commodore 64s by that time. I mean, it was becoming, it was a $300 and something million company. 2 years later, it was a $1 billion company. We had to finance that. So they needed me as the treasurer to deal with the banks. Remember, I had put the bank group together back in '83. And so at that point, especially with Jack gone, I was moved into the treasury position. And it was on the international side, not the U.S. company treasurer, but of the worldwide group.
Oh, okay. Now, well, I think we do have to take 2 steps back then. So Irving is the one who is primarily courting you. Is Jack at all involved in that process?
100%.
100%. So he's also trying to get you.
I rarely talk to just Irving. I was talking to Jack, and Jack welcomed me like a father into the company. And in fact, my office was in Westchester. He was in the corner office in House Drive. I was 2 offices over from him. It was right in that corporate part of the building. But I did work every Monday in New York because Irving Gould was in New York. So I sort of never moved to Pennsylvania because I had to be in New York. And frankly, I was overseas as much as I was in New York. So there was no point to move my family.
Gotcha. Now, so you're brought in. And the public relations part of it only lasts 2 months. Now, were you aware of any tensions between Irving and Jack? Was it a build-up? Was this something that happens all at once? Obviously, this is one of the most storied events in computer history. But what was your perspective in those 2 months leading up to it?
My perspective was never that Jack was going to be gone in 2 months. During all the years I was their banker, I'd meet with Irving, I'd meet with Jack when I was in Pennsylvania as a loan officer. There was never outward this dichotomy of their visions. However, once I started working there, you could tell that Jack had a vision that wasn't the same Irving's when it came to financing the company. You know, Jack would come in my office, or I'd be summoned to his office, and we'd talk about issuing stock, or we'd talk about bigger bank loans. And Irving would never talk about issuing stock. He hated dilution, so he wanted to raise more money. And then I remember being on one of these meetings, and Jack was talking about the pet jet. And why did we need a jet? Which was solely Irving. And I remember another meeting where all the marketing people and the finance people were in there, and we were talking about the budget for '94. And I remember Jack talking about, okay, we want to be $1 billion company. Do we have to spend money like it? And in fact, when you looked at the size of Commodore, you looked at the size of the R&D budget. Everybody complained that Irving didn't spend enough on R&D. Well, Jack didn't spend a lot on R&D. When you hear about who invented the PET, you hear about Chuck Peddle and a couple of engineers. When you hear about the VIC-20, it was Chuck Peddle and a couple of engineers. When you hear about the Commodore 64, we didn't have, as a matter of fact, the engineering department at Commodore in Rittenhouse Drive was in a corner of the building, maybe 30%. The factory was in the back of the building where all the final assembly and shipping was. The corporate structure was facing the front of the building, the left side in the front where Irving had his office and all the finance. And then you had, and you could walk through engineering in as much time as you could walk through the corporate overhead. It wasn't that Commodore had brilliant engineers. It didn't have a lot of engineers. So, you know, Jack and Irving weren't driving the technological advance. It was the engineers that were driving it. And then the marketing people were trying to catch up with them how to market.
Gotcha. And was this, and did anybody inside the company ever try to explain to them how, that might be a problem, that the engineers weren't being supported or being given a vision? I mean, was it an issue of just
the success of Commodore was the engineering group. and Jack going with it, and Irving finding the financing. It was a pretty good system. But Jack didn't go to engineering and say, this is what I want. Engineering had a whole bunch of projects while Jack was there, but it was always making the C64 better. They did have one 16-bit group going. I think it was headed up by David Haney and a bunch of other guys that was working actually with a Motorola 68,000. And that, if I remember, was a C90 or C900 project. Most of those people left when Jack left at Atari. Not that Jack left knowing he was going to buy Atari. I mean, Jack left. So we're on this plane going to Comdex. And we're on the pet jet. And I remember Lee Schreiber was on the plane, and Irving, and Stephen Greenberg, the guy that handled the investment relations. I was on it. And so we're flying out there, and there were a couple of other people. And we're flying. I said Lee Schreiber. And I remember the discussion came up about Jack had told Irving, when Comdex is over, I'm bringing all my sons in the company. I think Leonard wasn't working for the company. He was still going to grad school, but he was about to graduate. And I remember the discussion on the plane being about my three sons. They were talking about my three sons. And they were talking about Jack wanted his sons in the company. I think one was in Japan, actually, already. So I remember discussion being about what if Jack pushes this issue as an ultimatum. And I remember Irving said, where's he going to go? But somehow, and I don't know the discussion, no one was in the room. You know, all these people are writing articles about what really happened. But it was Irving and it was Jack and Lee Schreiber in the room talking about the direction of Commodore. And all I know is a very quiet plane back to New York because Jack had basically walked out of the room, left the hotel. Comdex had ended the day after Comdex, and everybody was wondering he was really going to walk because he had told Irving he was going to walk. And the following morning, our phones lit up like crazy because Jack was telling everybody, I'm out of here.
Wow. So so he leaves. There's this break. Now, and I know you did a lot with international, and I definitely need to get into that with you. But so he leaves, and obviously we know later on he goes and buys Atari, and a bunch of the engineers and other staff leave with him. Is there anybody else ups and leaves when he announces that he's going? Or
no. As a matter of fact, immediately nobody left because he didn't have a company. So there was nowhere to go. He wasn't going to all his friends saying, hey, show your loyalty to me, leave. As a matter of fact, I had a conversation after he left, and he never once said, join me. He knew I was more closely aligned with him, but he didn't hold that against me. And I met Jack several times later at various computer shows, and it was like, old home day. Held no grudges against the people that stayed at Commodore. He didn't ask a lot of people to leave, but once he went to Atari, a bunch of the C900 or C90 group that was working on the 16-bit got up and left. That engineering was clearly picked. So, and then we sued him because of the people, the engineering people leaving with corporate secrets, if I might say. Now, in Commodore's or in Atari's, Commodore never got that 16-bit. As a matter of fact, by the fall of 90, we were talking with Atari. And Atari had, I think it was $500,000. We were talking with Amiga. And Amiga had $500,000 note to Atari that had an end date, or they would acquire the rights to the Amiga computer chips. The three big chips of the Lorraine and whatever. And so I remember having, you asked how involved I was. Well, finance was always involved because they needed $4 million as a bridge loan, And I remember the meeting we had in Westchester with the Atari people, and it came up.
Atari or Amiga?
Amiga.
Amiga. Yeah, no problem. I just want to make
sure. And the Amiga people are there, and they're saying they need $4 million, and then they said somehow it got to how much would it cost to buy you? Because we knew that Atari was working 16-bit computer with the people they had poached from us. And we reached a deal at, I think it was November or something. It was like 3 in the morning, and we reached a $24 million number, which is what we eventually bought them for. I mentioned Thyssen-Bornemisza having bought into. So the day after Jack leaves, and remember, my office was next to Irving's in New York on 3rd Avenue. He says to me, we've got our replacement for Jack. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, it's Wednesday, and he only quit on Monday. And it was Marshall Smith, who was the guy who bought Interpool from Irving at Thyssen-Bornemisza. So here's a guy that's steel, heavy industry, manufacturing, knows less about the computer industry than anybody I've ever known. And he's now the CEO. And off we go. And so, a lot of people blame him for the disaster called the Plus-4, But the Plus-4 was introduced at the computer shows in the fall of '83. So in '84, when it was a complete disaster, who introduced the Plus-4? It was under Jack's watch. But everybody blamed Marshall Smith for that. Now, yes, it was a disaster, but all the manufacturing and all the demand was still the Commodore 64. It wasn't that Commodore went like this because of the Plus-4. It's just that we never sold any Plus-4s. We built a bunch of them, and that would hurt us in '85, but they were still making zillions of Commodore 64s, and the Plus-4 was barely introduced in Europe. It was introduced to computer shows. We made a bunch of them, but nobody wanted it. They wanted this.
Yeah. Now, okay, I got to go back for just a second here. So you talked about how the stock tanked, and we talked earlier about how when you joined the company and when those first loans were made, the stock was an over-the-counter stock. What was the status of the stock? Was it something that was properly traded at the time Jack left? Had it become something that if you could have issued more stock, it would have been a source of capitalization, or was it still a bit of a doldrum?
Compared to the shenanigans today, it never had a multiple like some of today's multiples. It had a good multiple. It never, it was the fastest growing company in the home computer market. They had, vanquished TI. Radio Shack was out of the market. It was such a growing market that there was the IBM PC Junior coming in. So it deserved a good multiple. But when the founder of a company basically leaves, everybody gets cold feet. I remember after the November Comdex show that Merrill Lynch initiated coverage of the stock. And the stock was really growing after Merrill Lynch was now saying it's a buy. And their timing could not have been worse because I can't tell you dollar for dollar where it was, but let's say the stock had basically gone up 50% from the introduction of the Plus-4. That tells you what Wall Street knows. To Jack leaving, and the stock just came down. I think in terms of numbers, the stock never again reached where it was for Jack leaving, but an awful lot of other stuff started happening. And so, and Jack dumped the stock. So you put all those shares on the market. The stock's not going up. When he makes a clean break.
Okay, so he actually just dumped everything.
He walked out the door and slammed the door and wanted no to his own. As it turned out, he got a pretty good price for his stock. But he announced and sold. Nothing illegal about it.
No. Oh, wow. Yeah. What kind of percentage did he own? I mean, just roughly.
Oh, I think Irving was like 13%. He might have been 6%.
Okay. That's
I mean, he didn't own enough. I think he was the second biggest shareholder. But Irving controlled a big chunk.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, okay, so everything is topsy-turvy after he leaves. Now, you are doing a lot of stuff internationally. What was and there's a couple of different deals. I know Commodore is huge in Europe, especially in Germany. That's like a gigantic. What was the relationship between Commodore US and the European affiliates at that point, or seats?
So let's first talk about the direction of Commodore at the time. In June of 84, now Jack has left. In June of 84, we put together a $100 million loan. The C64 was still booming, okay? Jack's gone. The banks are still behind us. So $84 million. In August of 84, because we were so big in Europe, Barclays Bank and a bunch of UK and German banks put up another 25 million pounds. And then in January of 85, we do our first public debt issue, which was 100 million Deutschmarks, was back then about $30-odd million, maybe $35 million, through Vereinsbank in Munich, and we did a public debt offering. So Commodore is still, and the stock's beginning to come back, now, in January of 85, we bought the Amiga. We were getting a 16-bit future. We're still selling tons of Commodore 64s. Things are going good, even though the plus 4 is just a bad memory of the fall of 84. In 85, people were throwing money at us. It was fun being treasurer. I wasn't answering calls saying, what the hell's wrong with Commodore? I was answering calls, how can we lend you money? How can we do a debt issue? I was having meetings with Hong Kong bankers and German bankers, and everybody wanted a piece of the action. That stock was beginning to come back. Marshall Smith was, as a corporate manager, it wasn't just Jack's whim. Everybody bought into, we were hiring a lot of corporate type. I had like 30-odd controllers all around the world reporting to me. You asked about Europe. We had Basel, Switzerland as the European headquarters. We were manufacturing the C64 in Germany and in Braunschweig. We had sales offices in every European company. A big problem in June of 85 was building more inventory. Things were going great. It wasn't until the end of 85 that IBM crashed PC Junior and the rest of the market went. But in 85, everything was going, and Irving Gould looked like a genius. He got rid of Tramiel and brought in all these corporate guys.
Now, from a banking standpoint, was the whole fiasco in Canada seen more as a Gould problem or a Tramiel problem?
By then, nobody cared. The problem of Canada was answered when Irving got the first loan back in 81 or something through Manufacturers Hanover. Once you opened the door that Manufacturers Hanover was going to bank this, and once the success started, people didn't worry about the ghost of Atlantic acceptance in the 70s.
Gotcha. Now, I also had to ask, in South America, obviously much smaller market, but there was a sub-license for assembly of the machine in Argentina of the C64. Do you have any recollection of how that came about?
Yeah, there were 100% duty in South America. If you sold a Commodore 64 for $300 in Texas, when they imported it into Argentina and Brazil and Paraguay, they all had 100% duty. The same thing in India. We couldn't send any of these to India. They were all going in the back of suitcases because of the 100% duties. That was just to get around.
Gotcha. Okay. And that
was tiny.
Tiny. Yeah. I mean, it was. I grew up in Argentina at that time.
I was wondering where that question came from.
Yeah. I mean, my Commodore, my C64 actually came from the States, but my family moved down there in 85. So I actually got there, and the place was littered with C64s everywhere. But all from a local manufacturer, Drean, which was they were doing everything from Whirlpool dishwashers, anything.
But the truth be told, we shipped them the cases from Hong Kong. We shipped them the keyboards. I believe, right from Japan. We shipped them circuit boards out of the Hong Kong factory. I remember Bob Gletto, who was in charge of that, wondering, where are all these circuit boards going? Because there was another guy in between of that whole too, who was setting up South America. I can't remember his name, but there was an awful lot going out of Hong Kong that went right to South America.
Gotcha.
But they didn't do much local content.
Maybe
the power supplies were. That was.
Gotcha. I just know they were all labeled with the Argentine version of Made in Argentina, which was Industria Argentina, and they had a slightly different nameplate. So they added the local company's name to the little nameplate at the top. But other than that, it was the same exact machine.
And if you opened one of those up, it would have had the Hong Kong stamp on the circuit board.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Just was always curious about how that deal came about. Okay,
it was duty. It was to get around the duty.
Yeah. Okay. What was the relationship between Commodore UK and Commodore Germany like? Were they allowed to act independently, or was one of them in charge of the other?
To the extent any subsidiary was acting independently, they both had their own general managers. They both purchased their product through Basel, where transfer pricing left some of the profits. As far as I know, and I never saw anything to the contrary, we were one big happy family. So when we got together for European distributor meetings, I didn't see how Speyer or the UK, I'm not sure who was head of the UK back then. Bob Gletto was in charge of Hong Kong by then. But there were no issues that I knew of.
Okay. Yeah, no, I didn't think there were any conflicts as such. I was just wondering if there was a hierarchy or if there was any kind of centralized management at that point.
The centralized management was always Westchester.
Gotcha. Was the Japanese market any relevant percentage of the company's business post-VIC-20?
No. If we tried a couple of Japanese products, but the Japanese computer industry was slower. The home computer industry was slower in taking off than the European one. The Japanese economy back then wasn't quite as strong as it would get later in that decade. So, no, we rarely, and the numbers are there on the Facebook page where we break out by continent and by country, and Japan was never that large a market.
Gotcha. Okay. I just remember that there was quite a bit of penetration of the PET, and I know the VIC-20 launched there first. I was just wondering whether or not there had been any kind of traction with the C64 at all. But
we sold a lot of computers there, but not like they were selling in North America.
Now, back to the States. You've already touched on it with the IBM PC Junior. But I do have to go back. So Irving Gould stuck to his guns, no dilution of the stock throughout all of this period.
Never issued stock.
Never issued stock. Oh my goodness. Okay. Was there ever any conception of maybe creating some subsidiary company that they could issue stock for and then basically raise capital that way and have the holding company still owned by Gould or some other kind of scheme like that?
No, the Commodore Finance TV with the company set up the German debt issue. Again, it was non-convertible to stock. I do know towards the end of my tenure at Commodore, after the Amiga came out, I was out on the West Coast at Drexel Burnham. Remember those guys? Drexel Burnham was issuing what they called junk bonds.
Okay, yeah.
Michael Milken junk bond. And I went to the Predators Ball out in Beverly Hills to see if we could do a convertible debt. And word got out that we were out there trying to convertible debt, and the stock tanked. I remember coming back from the West Coast and having lunch with Irving, and he said, well, that was one fine job you did. I only lost about $8 million on you. And we are convinced that Drexel Burnham leaked that they were going to do a debt issue so the stock would tank, and convertibility of that debt issue was very attractive to people they were selling the box. It was as close you could get to a rape as you can in this, because nobody other than me and Irving and maybe 4 or 5 other people knew we were doing that. And yet while I was out there negotiating the terms of this and how much convertibility this debt issue had, the stock falls by 25%. Things like that don't just happen. And I remember coming back and I said, see, you can't issue debt. That's convertible. And that was the end of that argument.
Oh, man.
I still have all those documents.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I have a coffee mug from that conference. 6.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. I still have actually the tote bag. It's one of the funny things you collect, right?
At some point, you're going to have to scan and take pictures of all of this. This has got to go into some kind of digital archive for people to see.
A lot of it's already been scanned by Dave McCurdy.
Oh, okay.
At that Commodore Historical Society.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, he has basically scanned 90% of what I have. There's a couple of other things he's not privy.
Gotcha. I can imagine. Okay, now, so the IBM PC Junior. Now, how, from the internal structures of Commodore, because we've talked a little bit about engineering-based new product, marketing catching up, was there anybody inside the company, either before or after Jack left, that was kind of trying to assess what the market was doing and what the competitors were up to?
So in the fall of 3, right?
I believe
yeah, the fall of 83, Jack Tramiel is being interviewed by, I think it was 60, and they asked him about IBM entering the market, and his response was they should be very afraid of it. I'm not worried about, they said things like IBM's a giant and this and that, and Tramiel, they said, I'm the giant and they're coming into my corner of it. Within a year, they did fail, but they were selling their product cheaper than a C64. And that was the end of the C64, and that was the beginning of problems at Commodore because we had a very bad. So no
this would have been Christmas of
'85. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But this would have been Christmas '85.
No, Christmas of '84.
Christmas of '84. Okay.
Yeah, Jack left in January.
Yeah.
They crashed the price at the end of the year. We were already looking at 16-bit machines. That was the end of the 8-bit era when the PC Junior failed.
Gotcha. And so the launch of the Amiga in '85. Now, and if I put all the pieces together, so you have very bad capitalization. You're running
lots of debt. Remember, I was very good at raising debt.
I was about to say, you guys have been doing nothing but raising debt, and I'm guessing most of it hasn't been paid back yet. The cash cow of the company is no longer generating. You're paying to house inventory.
It still is at the time you're talking about. When the Amiga came out, we had no problem.
Oh, okay. Okay, when the Amiga comes out.
The problems really hit the fan in '86.
Okay.
Because when the PC Junior crashed, it was the U.S. market. Europe was booming. Europe was becoming the bulk of our sales, and there was no sign things were slowing down.
Okay.
So PC Junior killed the U.S. market, but not Europe because they weren't selling there.
Gotcha. Okay. And
Harold Speyer, who ran Germany, was becoming the most important person in the company because he oversaw Europe, and sales in Europe were through the roof. Now, just remember, even though sales in Europe were through the roof, the C64 by then had been priced at a very low price. We were making lots of money, no room for error, okay? You have to go to '86 to start seeing the wear and tear of the C64, even in Europe, the beginning of the shipping of Amiga. Remember, Amiga's, June of '85?
Yeah. It's '85, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also a completely different price class.
Totally different market. And so you had the C64 getting long in the tooth. You had everybody looking at 16-bit. You still had the marketing people and Harold Speyer and the Germans saying there's no need to worry about PC compatibility. Nobody was doing PC compatibility. Even Compaq wasn't around. Digital Equipment was saying the PC is a flash in the pan. We are not going to office desktops, right? Meanwhile, at Commodore, there's an Amiga on every desk doing Lotus and, well, whatever 123 was back then. I mean, we were embracing the office computer as an Amiga. My PC I used every day was an Amiga 2000, Amiga 1000.
Yeah.
So no one saw this coming. And we hired 86, by then Marshall was, and we hired Tom Radigan from Pepsi. What the hell did he know about them? Apple had hired somebody else from Pepsi.
I was about to say, yeah.
So we were, oh yeah, this is now marketing 101. We need mass market marketers. It was when Radigan came in, we're now in 86, that all the old people kicked it. So Radigan wanted his own people. He brought in some finance guy from Pepsi. I was told, thank you. I remember going to Irving and saying, you know, I'm basically being forced out here. And I expected him to say, we'll find another home for you. And he said, make sure I have your phone number. We have a lot. I went home and I said, he didn't stand up for me. And that was after I'd done all these internal reports about the direction of the company. So
now, those internal reports, because it must have been pretty obvious that the Amiga was had a very slow burn at the start.
It had me basically shipping, sending out dribs and drabs.
Yeah, and I'm very curious. What was your assessment of the role of the Amiga? Was it supposed to become a Commodore 64 replacement? Or was it supposed to be purely targeting the office market? What was your thinking at the time of, you know, how is this supposed to be working as far as the flow of machines that Commodore had been selling so far?
So the thinking was the C64 was showing the Plus 4 gained no traction with all its built-in software and productivity. You know, the Plus 4 was this whole productivity. People didn't want it because it wasn't Commodore 6. The PC Junior was being given away. But the PC was there, and the corporate world was beginning to adopt the IBM desktop, leaving everybody else. So the desktop market in corporations of the Amiga wasn't there, even though the Amiga with its windowing feature was miles ahead of DOS. DOS was horrible. And the Amiga had multitasking. The Amiga had color. The Amiga was cheaper than an IBM PC. You would think it would own the market. It didn't. It didn't because everybody said it plays great games. And does the finance officer of a company need all those sounds and graphics? And after all, do you buy an IBM, which is running all their mainframe, or do you buy this great machine called the Amiga that's incompatible? I think everybody, and by the way, the stock was coming back at this point. The banks were trying to throw money at us. Everybody thought we were going to lead the PC business into the 16-bit world, but Commodore wasn't in the PC business. It was in the home computer market. And in the spring, I was at a board meeting, and this was near the end of the reign of Marshall Smith because it wasn't going anywhere. And I remember after the board meeting, a couple of the directors, including Irving, came to me and said, we really don't know what the inventory broken down to. Go to Hong Kong and then go to Europe and let us know what. We had a huge inventory after the Christmas of F-85. I mean, we had a huge inventory, and even the banks would. But nobody knew what that inventory was. And I'm not talking about whether they were C64s. We were digging into the level of PCB boards and for what machine. And that report I did is on the archives that Curdy has put up, down to PC boards, down to the cost of those boards, the cost of the RAM. I mean, I had 4 controllers around the world working sort of like a skunk works. It was off-site. None of this went through. This was all done by facsimile to my home. And I spent about 3 months putting this. And then I met with Irving at his apartment with a bunch of those same directors. And that's when they forced out Marshall, because the report basically showed a bunch of arrows coming right for Commodore because the inventory was all upside. We had millions and millions of dollars in parts for machines, whether they be +4s, whether they be Commodore 128s, but it wasn't what we wanted to sell going forward, and there was a shortage of Amiga parts. So everybody thought we had this big build-up inventory for the Amiga, but in reality. So they hired through Pepsi. They got rid of Marshall. And I remember that I was considered the old guard, even though I had written the report that got him the job, and he wanted me. Because who knows? I knew where all the bodies were buried, and he couldn't trust me because if things went bad, I'd be a tool of the board again. And I left, and I went into a software company up here in Massachusetts. I then started my own computer company for selling laptops through Computer Shopper.
Oh, cool.
I did very well in the business up until, I was 60-odd years old and basically got out of the
okay. It's fascinating. Fascinating story, especially those moments, that time for the company. I do have one final question. The Amiga, and I saw this was a breakdown you had of all the component costs and so forth. I saw this up on the archive, and I'll put links to it all in the show notes for the listeners. Now, when those costs came in, because that was not a cheap machine to put together, was there a consideration, especially when you found out Jack was coming back into the business and the C90 team left with the ST? Was there a consideration that, to do something else with the machine, or to either simplify it or to jack up the price so much that there would be a buffer, but it's going to be in a different price category? What was the reaction, if any, to those two factors, the cost of it and Jack coming in?
None of the meetings we went to discussed Atari. We weren't allowed to. Irving would not hear of what Jack might do at Atari. He didn't care. He didn't want to know. Atari at that point wasn't doing any gangbusters either. It wasn't that everything at that point was getting the machine out to people that need the graphics, the gamers. I remember, if you wanted to play games, you needed an Amiga, right? Atari did games too, but what was the hot machine?
Yeah, it was Amiga.
So and because of that, we weren't even thinking, even though I remember a meeting with the Germans saying, we have to do PC compatible, right? Just before I left, Bill Gates came to West, and I still have a disc called the Transformer. We were coming out with an IBM compatible bunch of software. It would run Lotus 1-2-3. There were things that were going to make the Amiga compatible with the software. But at that point, the Amiga was also more expensive than PC. I may have to be fact-checked on that, but I remember the Transformer never took off because by the time you bought an Amiga, you didn't really want to do black and white spreadsheets on it because the Transformer ran in black and white. DOS didn't really support windowing and colors.
Yeah.
So there was that problem of what did you want the Amiga to be, and by making it be a desktop computer, you took away the best part of it, the Amiga. Mm. I mean, I started using the Amiga. I still have a 1000, in my museum downstairs, and
Yeah.
So to answer your question, the inventory wasn't driving the marketing. The costs weren't driving the market. And back in the early 86, we had horrible yields on the Amiga chips. We were making those Amiga chips in 60% or 50% yield. I mean, it was terrible.
Oh, wow.
So that drove up our costs.
Okay. Don, I don't want to eat up any more of your time, but if I do have one question. It's a sort of two-part question I ask all of my interview subjects. Looking back at your entire breadth of your time, and I know we didn't talk about what you did after Commodore in great detail, but looking back at your entire career in the industry, what would you say is one trend that hit big that you did not see coming? And what would you say was one trend that you thought was going to be huge that just never took off?
One trend we missed was the internet. CompuServe came to visit us, right, in Westchester. I remember the meeting. I was there. And they brought in modems. You know how the old 8-bit modems sounded. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to hook up with Commodore. And we kicked them out. All our connectivity was being done with the VAX through engineering. We had connectivity. Totally missed it. Okay. A trend we thought that was going to be big that didn't. We had a group in Texas that was doing robotics. We had a Commodore robot. I remember taking a Commodore 64 in with a little bubble head into a banker's meeting. And we were going to make the Commodore 64 robot. Because we thought every house wanted a robot. The same group came up with the Commodore thermostat. So it was consumer group. Remember the Commodore thermostat?
Yeah.
We were talking about home automation. We even had a press release about Commodore was going to automate your home, turn the lights on and off and all that. Right? We were spending good engineering money on the robotics group down in Texas. Well, that never took off, did it? You still don't have home robots. No. And the automation now, you can turn a light on and off through your iPhone. That's not home automation. No. So that's a trend we thought would be big. We kicked out the CompuServe guys, which was strange because I had a packet terminal on 2 meters at home running a Commodore 64, where I was talking digitally to other hams on 2 meters using a packet cluster. We would send messages and email and stuff, but that was towards the end of my Commodore days. And remember, I wasn't in engineering. I was. So I think
that very much answered my question. Don, thank you so very much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. And as a C64 and Amiga kid, yes, you were there to help guide along the machines that wasted most of my youth. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Okay, Carl, thanks.
Thanks. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.